solutions. The title of this talk is Getting to Zero, and by that I mean zero emissions from the grid, from buildings, from transportation, and from industry. In some ways, zero is the wrong thing to aim at because the last 10 or 15 or 20% is pretty tough. That doesn't bother me at all. I think if we get to 80% reductions, we will have invented a lot more technologies and learned a lot more things. So, but there's a whole school of mostly academics who argue about the last 5 or 10% with all their might, telling you can't get the first 90% because of the last 10%. So don't pay attention to that. I am going to spend just a little bit of time on climate science because there are some characteristics that not everybody's super aware of, and because they motivate speed and scale. And I'm going to repeat those words all the time: speed and scale. We have very little time ahead of us. So let me jump right in. This is a fake picture of San Francisco after a lot of climate change on one side, and what's happening is the extreme becomes the norm. All climate change science is calibrated to 2 degrees C. That's how we hook all the models together. But nobody cares about 2 degrees C. In the real world, they care about a flood or a drought or a fire. And that's what we get with the extremes. It's what happens in the tails of the distribution that cause all the trouble. California recently had these stunning and horrible record fires. We're going to see a lot of those. It's inevitable. It wasn't caused by PG&E. It was caused by drought and heat and time. And that's going to keep happening. We've had floods too. This is San Jose. And you know what's happening in the Midwest in America these days. It's just staggering floods. There have been times when a third of Bangladesh, a country with enormous population, a third of the country was underwater. Thailand, many other parts of the world. I talked about the extremes becoming the norm. You remember this cold snap that happened about a month ago in Chicago, 40 degrees below zero? Everyone said, well, where's climate change? What happens?
Yeah, there's a laser, the green, the top green.
I got it.
Yeah.
There we go. The polar vortex is a curtain of air that separates the Arctic temperatures from the temperate zones. And because the Arctic is much colder than the temperate zones, that curtain of air has a lot of energy. It spins very fast, and there's a jet stream below it. That isolates the cold temperatures up in the north and keeps the rest of the temperate zones temperate. What happens is when you heat up the north faster than you heat up the rest of the world, and it's heating up at twice the rate right now, then that energy dissipates. And so instead of a nice tight circle, we get these big gloppy lobes. And so when there's a download, you get the 1,200-year drought that we have in California. When there's an upload, you get Arctic temperatures, or it's the other way around. When there's a download, you get the Arctic temperatures seeping down from the Arctic area. I was in June a couple of years ago. I was in Berlin a couple of years ago in June, and everyone was wearing hats and scarves and mittens in June because they had that phenomenon. So we're going to see these extreme colds, even as we have globally, as you can see, extreme heat. It's part of the New Deal. The extremes become the norm. This is near where I was raised. There are now 40 million acres of dead pine trees in America, running from New Mexico up into Canada, because we used to have lots of cold weather, and we don't have it anymore. And the cold weather killed pine beetles. So the pine beetles are thriving, and the forests are not. All right. Here's a cool graph from NASA. Standard distribution of temperatures. 1/3 under standard distribution would be colder than average, 1/3 would be average, and 1/3 would be warmer than average. So look at what's happening in the real world. That's just a nice little academic chart. So this is the data starting in the 50s, and you can see it beautifully fits that curve. But look what happens starting in the 80s. So those are real world data from NASA. And what happens is we've lost the cold. That's why we've lost that forest. We've reduced the normal from 1/3 of the time to 1/6 of the time. We've increased the hot, and now we've created all these extreme heats, which didn't exist before. And it's the extremes that get you. Never forget that. So that's the first thing. The extremes become the norm. The second thing one has to remember is that after a while, if we damage the climate enough, Earth systems take over. And they will hammer us, and make no mistake about it. The tundra across northern Russia, Siberia, northern Canada, and Alaska is packed with both frozen methane and soil carbon. And if you defrost that tundra, that soil carbon releases, and then it's a runaway. There's no physical way that human beings can control that once that's underway. There's evidence it's started already. So that's a feedback loop or a vicious cycle. Wildfires are another one, because you put a lot of carbon in the air, and because the smokes acts as a heat shield. Here's another one, Arctic ice. This is 1984 here, and 2016, same time of year. It used to be white, which bounces the sunshine off, and now it's dark, dark blue, which absorbs the sunshine. The point here is simple, and there's a bunch of other of these, that whatever we do will get magnified and actually run out of control at a certain point. So, speed matters. Let me talk about another completely counterintuitive phenomenon in climate change just for a sec. On the left is carbon emissions. This is what we do when we drive our cars and fly our planes and run our factories. On the right is carbon concentrations. This is what the world does to us, right? This is what happens to us, so what we do, what they do. So here's business as usual. If we just keep growing and growing and growing, the carbon concentrations reach unfathomable levels. Here's 1,200 parts per million, 1,500 parts per million. Right now we're at 415, right? Which is about double pre-industrial. So let's get smart and drive it down to zero between now and say 2060. What happens is with zero emissions, we have stable concentrations at 450, roughly, right? So we go to zero, and the Earth doesn't go back to cold. It goes back, it just stays where it is. Let's instead say we were a little bit stupid and a little bit slow, and so we waited a while before we went to zero. Look what happens. We stabilize at 650 parts per million, which is really an unthinkable part of the system. But here's the counterintuitive thing. It's actually harder to stabilize under most circumstances at this high number than at the low number. And why is that? It's because what stabilization requires is remaking the economy so that it produces less carbon dioxide emissions. And the amount of work you have to do to remake the economy is proportional to the distance down. That's the amount of the infrastructure you have to change, and the angle, the speed with which you have to change it. So if you fritter away time, you have to change a lot more infrastructure. That's that many more crappy buildings and crappy cars and crappy factories we build. And you have to change them all. And you have to do it more quickly. To stabilize at a high number, you still have to go to zero. Right? Any stabilization requires zero. And that's if you're lucky enough to beat the natural systems. Right? So that's why I'm so passionate about speed and scale. We have to get on that curve. I'm really impressed and really amazed at the quality of the people in this room, your dedication, and your focus on education. It seems like the nucleation of a really powerful army, and it is. But it's only going to work if you can land your energies on stuff that makes a large-scale difference, right? If you do something that's symbolic, and it checks a box, I did something, not you, but the public official that you're trying to affect, then they stop worrying about it, they go to the next thing, potholes or hospitals or whatever, right? So make sure that whatever you do has a large-scale consequence. I'm going to skip this slide, even though it's the scariest one I got. Okay. If you're really feeling like beating yourself up, I'll go back. Okay, so how do you focus in order to get speed and scale? The first thing is everything happens in 4 sectors. We got the grid, transportation, buildings, and industry. Right? If your policy idea doesn't affect one of these 4 sectors, you're not in the game. If you can't see how your United Nations meeting or your divestment strategy or your fuel efficiency in cars or whatever it is directly affects one of these 4 sectors, you're not in the game. And let me give an example which will probably make me unpopular and you might chase me out here with choices. Does anybody bring a picture? No, good. Okay, I'll tell you. So let's think about divestment. Why should we invest in coal companies? Why should we invest in oil companies? This doesn't sound right. It doesn't seem right if we're trying to decarbonize. So a lot of people have put thousands of hours into divestment. But does divestment change carbon use? Does it change lives? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Does divestment change carbon? No. I wish it did. I don't invest personally in coal and oil. But companies don't go broke because you sold your stock to somebody else, because every stock you sell, somebody bought, right? The biggest IPO in the world is about to happen, and it's Saudi Aramco. And they're lining up to invest in it. Capital finds returns. That's what it does. That's what capitalism is all about. Gravity pulls things down. So if you spend all your time trying to get Stanford, God bless them, to divest their endowment, which they'll never do, it doesn't matter. I mean, it kind of matters. It feels good. But if you divest and nothing happens, is that worse than nothing? Because you spent all that energy and you convinced all these people and you tried so hard and you didn't change any of these four physical systems. So keep that in mind. Now again, that's not a very popular thing to say. But we don't have time to do stuff that doesn't make a big difference. We just don't. Okay.
They're coming.
So how do we make a big difference? I'm going to start with a few principles. The first one is scale, speed and scale. Top 20 countries, 75% of the carbon emissions. We live in one of them. So we got no excuse not to deal with it. In fact, we're number 2. Historically, the U.S. has put more than a third of the carbon in the air already. So we have some sins to recover from. But I put this up here when I'm working with international audiences because here's the top 20 countries. And you know you're down in Zambia and Thailand at the bottom of that list, right? This is where you win. You win, and you don't have to win 185 countries to sign the Paris Agreement. You have to win the top 20 countries, especially the top 10 or so. The second thing is we don't need to invent new money. The world spends more than $5 trillion a year on energy and another 6 or 7 trillion on the infrastructure that sets energy patterns. That money can either land on brown choices or green choices, and the difference is policy, right? Does your utility bill pay for a gas plant, a coal plant, a solar farm, or a wind farm, right? And the reason I emphasize this, we don't need to invent money, we need policy, is because if you look at the biggest, nastiest fight in the UN meetings, it's about the rich countries are supposed to raise and spend $100 billion a year for the poor countries. Well, we ought to. That would be the ethical thing to do. But do a little math. $100 billion per year compared to $11 trillion per year, right? Focus on policy, get the job done. It's all about policy. The cash flow is there. Here's the next interesting thing. The economics are increasingly there. We did a study of every coal plant in America to find out whether you could replace them with clean energy at a cost or a savings. Here's the punchline. 75% of coal plants in America could be shut down and replaced with brand new wind and solar at a net savings already. And by 2025, it's 86% of coal-fired power plants. Right? So economics is on our side, and that's a beautiful tailwind if we take advantage of it. The downside of having this tailwind is incumbent industries fight back, and they fight back very hard. So the fight is on. It was okay to promote solar and wind when it was Tinker Toys, the boutique stuff, but it ain't no more. It's a real deal. And I would say, if you have a grown-up technology, you make grown-up enemies, and we got them. So we're going to beat them. Okay. The third thing, the third major point, so big countries, policy is required, is you have to choose the policy correctly, right? If you focus on the trivial, you lose. And so we analyzed hundreds of policies. We built something called the Energy Policy Simulator. You can look it up on energypolicy.solutions. And you can run a model. We've done it for 11 countries now. You can run a model in real time with up to 50 different policies. You can change building codes. You can change fuel efficiency standards. You can change carbon taxes. You can put an EV policy in. And it'll tell you in real time what's happening with carbon emissions. And the punchline is there's a small number of policies that make a huge difference, and there's a large number that don't make much of a difference at all. And I'm going to walk through these, so you don't need to take notes or pictures here. The second thing we did here in thinking about which policies matter is we created what they used to call a McKinsey cost curve, but we did ours with a twist. What this does is it has the price, this is a negative price, this is something you get paid to do, times carbon tons. And this is something you pay a lot of money to do. And we rank them according to those two dimensions. How much they saved or cost, and how much carbon they put in there. And the good news is, almost all of it is either free or incredibly cheap. And again, some of these make a big thing. Fuel economy standards for cars is right there. Carbon pricing is right there. And some of them are too small to put on the chart. Right? So you focus on policy in the big countries for the 4 sectors, and you choose them well. That's the good part of the thing. It's not all, however. What I'm going to do now is walk through each of the 4 sectors and talk a little bit about the characteristics of them. And then I'm going to wind up with some specific intervention strategies. I have been at this longer than Matt says. This is my 30th year doing this. And I've learned not just which policies work, but what kind of interventions are most effective at driving new and good quality. So let me start with the grid. The grid is especially important because there's this lovely saying, which is only partly true, but decarbonize the grid, decarbonize electricity, and electrify everything.
Yes.
Right? An electric vehicle, an electric heat pump, an electric industry running off a wind and solar grid, kind of cool, kind of great. Okay, so we've all, oops, I'm going to do that. We've all seen these price drops amazingly. This one is solar. And as the price goes down, the volume goes up, the sales. Or you could put it the other way around. As the sales go up, the price goes down. Which causes which? I don't care, as long as we're doing it. And the truth is, there's an interaction, right? So right now, the cheapest power ever supplied on planet Earth has been from solar cells in Mexico and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is going crazy with renewable energy. Phew. They're still going to sell oil when they can. That's another story. Okay. This is the part of the country today, basically the price of solar. And the blue is roughly competition. So look how much of the United States solar is now competitive. And this is how much it'll be in 2025. That doesn't mean solar solves all problems, but it solves a lot of problems. And in fact, balancing the grid becomes more of an issue. It turns out balancing the grid is not that hard either if you're willing to take advantage of a whole suite of different technologies and practices. I studied power systems planning in my engineering graduate program. And I was taught, just keep turning power plants on whenever the load grows and turn them off when the load goes down. And that's a nice way to have a career. But that has nothing to do with the utility of the future, where you're dispatching demand and supply and heterogeneous power plants, and you're running across large territories, and you're buying and selling, and so forth. I won't get into that unless there's Q&A. The point here is, look how cheap solar is everywhere in the country. And by the way, you know the South. If you want the Deep South to have a political enlightenment and call up Al Gore and apologize, we're not going to get speed and we're not going to get skill. On the other hand, if you want the people in the South to buy something cheaper than what they got already, this is good, no problem, right? So you don't need to evangelically convert people to your cause as long as they end up doing the right thing anyway. Whatever path takes you there is just fine, as long as you get there. Okay, this is onshore wind, same thing, price plummeting, volumes going up. And this is where offshore wind, or where onshore wind, sorry, is cheaper than the competition. Look at that wind belt right down the middle. You know who has the most wind power in the country? Texas, because you guys know everything. Oklahoma, they hate the idea of wind, but they love wind. Right? Did I get contradicted by something? No. Nope. I spent some time with the previous governor of Wyoming. Wyoming put a severance tax on wind. They hated it so much because they thought they competed with coal. It does compete with coal. They're right. However, coal is going down. Love it or hate it. Wear the hat or don't wear the hat. Right? And so this Republican right-wing billionaire wanted to put in a big wind farm and a big wind transmission line, and the Republican governor took a think and said, well, wait a minute. We're going to be surveying land. We're going to be digging holes. We're going to be filling them with concrete. We're going to be putting up steel towers. We're going to be wiring them. Those are my guys that do that work. Jobs, exactly. And so he decided instead of being pro-coal, he was going to be pro-Wyoming, and they permitted the largest wind farm in the country, and they lopped off the proposed wind severance tax. So wind is happening. Offshore wind. This is the coolest thing ever. So those the winds offshore don't blow at the same time as the winds onshore. They balance each other beautifully, and they run many more hours a day, and they're much more consistent. The other thing about offshore wind is if you put it 12 miles offshore, you can't see it because of the curvature of the Earth. So you don't have the NIMBY problems, right? And you don't have as many sighting problems because you don't have neighbors. And so offshore wind was really expensive until recently. It dropped in price by more than half in the last 5 years. And it's now becoming incredibly cheap. So there's these huge offshore wind farms. The other thing about offshore wind is it's easy to move those blades around. You know those blades, a single blade is now considerably longer than a football field. And that's hard to drive on the streets of San Francisco. But it's easy to throw on a ship, right? And so this is how big these new wind turbine blades are. This is, I don't know if you can see this, but there's the Eiffel Tower. And there's the biggest one there. Right? I think each windmill will supply the electricity for 8,000 homes all year. So, pretty cool, right? So, and if you think about the East Coast, where there's these amazing carbon commitments that are being made, by Cuomo and all the other governors up and down, they don't have any place to put all those windmills and solar offshore. They also learned how to float them. Why is that important? Because if you go off the coast of California, the seabed just drops away precipitously, the continental shelf. But if you float them, that's okay. So it's happening. The Danes are becoming experts in this. A number of the ocean, one of the bigger oil companies in the world used to be called Statoil. It's now got a sweet name, Equinor. They decided that their specialty wasn't necessarily oil; it was doing really hard things in the high oceans. And so why not become an offshore wind provider? So that's how they're transforming, by looking at their skills, and it's working. Okay, I'm going to skip this text. So what's the policy that got us there, and what's the policy that's going to get us further? And the answer is one policy: renewable portfolio standards. An absolutely kick-ass idea. Basically, you're telling, if you want to sell electricity, you have to have an ever-growing fraction of it from renewable energy. That's the killer app, right? And so there are now 30 states with renewable portfolio standards, and there's some other states that are just waiting around. But they'll get there. And these are old targets. Let me show you the new stuff. This is from the last year or so. These are jurisdictions that have committed to 100% renewables, and a number that are kind of on the way. They're doing the studies, the legislation's pending, right? So 100%, that's pretty gutsy, right? And again, I know how to get to 80, and once we get there, they'll figure out the last bit. So I'm not worried about that tailpipe. When a political leader sticks his or her neck out and says, I'm going to do 100% renewables, what do they need? They need political support. They need technical backup, and they need political support. So if they don't get rewarded for making these courageous commitments, shame on us, right? And when they sign that bill, if they are not cheering in the streets and op-eds and asthmatic children breathing deep and so forth, we're not doing our job. Okay. Let me switch to transportation. So there's one more thing about, let me go back here. Besides renewable portfolio standards, it does matter that the people who run the grid learn how to balance the grid with lots of variable sources. It is a new practice, and a lot of them are already holding up their hands and saying, I can't do it. You know who's not doing that? A guy named Steve Berberick, who runs the California Independent System Operator. He says, I can do 80% without breaking a sweat. And you should see his control room. Remember, he's giving electricity to 40 million Americans, all Californians. His control room makes NASA look like an early Pong game or something. and by the way, they've got this amazing control facility, and then they have another one in an undisclosed location. Seriously, because if one goes down, you want the whole, they've duplicated everything. And so I actually organized a training program for a bunch of members of the U.S. Senate and Congress, and Steve Berberick was one of the teachers, or whatever, and they were just blown away. Because here's the thing, he wakes up every morning knowing he has to keep the grid alive. The one thing that will get you unelected in America, remember Gray Davis?
Yep.
Blackouts?
Yep.
If you have a blackout, you're out of office. If you do the right thing, let's give them rewards. Okay, let me turn to vehicles. And by the way, the best electric vehicle is an electric bicycle. So when you're doing your work with the towns of Fort Madero and San Rafael and Nevada, whatever the third one is, make sure there's something about electric bicycles in there too. I want a little sticker for my bicycle that says my other car is oil. So look what's happened to the price of lithium-ion batteries per year. That's called a learning curve. Learning curves are our friend, and I use them all the time. Because when you cross that magic threshold where it gets cheaper and cheaper, then the market is tailwind instead of headwind, right? And so lithium-ion, it's still an electric car still costs more than a gasoline car, and they do have somewhat different requirements. They don't cost more over the lifetime, but they certainly do initially. But we're going the right direction here. Volkswagen got its hands slapped to the tune of $24 billion in America alone for selling 500,000 cheap vehicles. So what's really impressive about that is not the $24 billion, a lot of which, by the way, goes to electrification infrastructure, including California. California got $1 billion to electrify its roads. But Volkswagen is now completely retooling to build electric cars. That's the real significance of that achievement. By the way, that was a small group, the International Council on Clean Transportation. 40 people in that organization that figured that cheap out. Pretty cool. I told them they should have got a percentage. Anyway, so batteries are getting very cheap. They're on a learning curve. The first vehicles that you want to electrify are the vehicles that run all day long downtown, which are what? Buses, garbage trucks, delivery trucks. I spent some time in Shenzhen, China. Every single bus is electric, 18,000 buses. Every single taxi is electric. Every single Didi, that's their Uber, will be electric by the end of this year. And every single delivery truck is electric. And every single parking place they build has to have new parking place has to have a charger in it, right? And Shenzhen is in the richest part of China, but their per capita income is about a quarter of ours. So it can be done, right? If something exists, it must be possible. This is we need a little sobriety about electric vehicles too. We need a backup strategy, or part of the strategy. So this is, yeah, you can tell there's an energy nerd crowd here. This is the Energy Information Administration's projection of electric vehicle penetration through, or sales I should say, through 2050. If you want a job at the Energy Information Administration, bring a ruler. That's what they do. Somebody's going to have a pitchfork by the time this is over. This is Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and this is our own model showing an S-curve with, by the time 2040 or so, you're at 60 or so percentage EV sales. But that's sales. That's not fleet numbers, because a lot of cars have to retire to get those percentage numbers up. So this is fleet numbers, and the gray is the internal combustion engine through 2050. And this is an aggressive adoption strategy. This is if we do a good job. And so the consequence of this is we also need to make gasoline cars super, super efficient, right? You can't give up that battle just because you open a new front with electric vehicles. And there's a lot of options to do that. This is the same group, International Council on Clean Transportation, that did the VW cheat. They've worked in all the major jurisdictions on getting vehicle standards up to 55 miles per gallon, 57 miles per gallon, 57. It's a race to the top. Or it was until somebody came along the scene and made a little part of it a race to the bottom. There are a lot of options to do this. Lightweighting. My car is a BMW i3. It's a kind of little ugly hatchback thing. It's made of carbon fiber. So from here on up, it's carbon fiber, and from here down, it's aluminum. And it weighs just over half as much as the average car in America. But it's just as safe because carbon fiber is super strong. Right? So lightweighting is a big deal. Aerodynamics. You ever look under a car? Messy? Ever look under an airplane? Smooth? That's fixable, right? Low rolling resistance tires. Pretty straightforward. There's a whole bunch of different options to make cars more fuel efficient. We should be looking at 55 or plus miles per gallon cars. There's just no reason. There's no reason to be driving around at 20, 25, 30 miles per gallon. And these pickup trucks and SUVs, same deal. You want to drive that thing? Fine. Dial up the numbers. Okay. What policies work? Two of them, really. The zero-emission vehicle suite of policies, mostly tax credits or mandates, right? And fuel efficiency standards for vehicles. Those are the killer apps in transportation. That's what it is. And then I put up this word continuous improvement. What do I mean by that? This is actually something we need to do across the board. I'm going to give a positive and a negative example. The positive example is the youngest governor in California's history. You know who that was?
Jerry Brown.
Also the oldest. And no doubt the coolest. So he signed something called Title 24, which is a building code in California. And he put a little sentence, a little gizmo inside of it that says it gets stronger every 3 years, based on whenever a technology is cost effective in one or more of the 16 different climate zones for the state. So, and the bureaucrats, the technocrats of the California Energy Commission were charged with doing this. So in all those intervening years, the building code's gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And it didn't have to go back to the legislature. And it didn't have to go back to those Republican governors or any other governors, right? So continuous improvement is magic. Let me give you the counterexample. Gerald Ford, in 1974, remember him? Yeah. What was his motto?
Falling down stairs?
No, that's what he did. Whip inflation now, remember? Really showing my age here. He signed into law the CAFE law, Corporate corporate average fuel efficiency law. That's the CAFE standards, right? And so we went from 13 miles per gallon average new car to 26. We doubled in 10 years. And then we went flatline for administration after administration until sort of the Bush-Obama time. And then we doubled again under Obama. So imagine if he said, instead of a target of 26 miles per gallon, what if he said 4% a year improvement? We would have improved every year. We would have saved over $1 trillion that we sent to countries to hate us. Right? That was dumb to miss that. But ask yourself, how many policies have continuous improvement built in? Almost none. It's a policy design principle that's neglected for no reason, at least in my opinion. It shouldn't be. So this is the big deal. Now, when you have an intransigent or worse president, turn to the states. Who makes the most energy decisions in our world? It's the states. The states set building codes. The state sets the utility standards. The states do the metropolitan transportation. The states, under California, under the Clean Air Act, the states can either follow the federal way or the California way. And the California way is better. And so more than half the population in America has signed up for the California way, including fuel efficiency standards. Now, the president is trying to eliminate states' rights to choose, eliminate California's rights to be cleaner. They want to force California to be dirtier than the federal number. Well, that's not good, right? They should get whacked for that. That's not the right word. You know what I mean? Let me go to buildings. My first job was designing and building solar homes back in Colorado, which is easy to do in Colorado. It's very cold, but we have tons of sunshine. And it turns out if you want a good solar home, you have to do about 4 things. You have to have really good windows that let the light and heat in, but don't let the heat back out if it's cold weather climate. You have to have some shading so that it only does that in the winter, not in the summer. You have to have really good insulation so you don't waste energy. And you have to have some thermal mass to absorb the heat. That's it. And orientation. So maybe 5 things if you're lucky. When you do those things, you can reduce your heating requirements by 90%, and the incremental cost is about 1%. And that house, if you built it right, will last 100 years. So you just created a 100-year asset. So the technology that made a lot of this possible is the so-called low emissivity windows, which keeps the heat inside. They've made these very sophisticated now so you can tune them up. So if you're in Florida or Arizona, they keep the heat out. And if you're in the Rockies, they keep the heat in. And if you do that, plus solar, plus overhangs, plus thermal mass and good insulation, there's no reason your house should use hardly any energy at all. Then what you do use, you should supply it with a heat pump. So a heat pump is a device to gather heat in the winter or coldness in the summer from the outside and bring it inside through a phase change material. Everybody has one in their house already. It's their refrigerator, right? The refrigerator swaps temperatures for you by compressing and decompressing a refrigerant. It's a really simple technology. Here's what it gets you. It gets you 4 times as much heat per unit of electricity as an electric resistance heater. And so all of a sudden, electricity as a heater is cost effective compared to gas. And so, bingo, let's turn off the gas. And what else do we use gas for? Well, we use it for hot water. The heat pump works for that too. We use it for cooking. So who here has used an induction cook stove? They're pretty amazing, aren't they? Yeah. They're fast. They work. I was skeptical until I tried one. So anyway, we need to make buildings more or less zero carbon. Now this is some quick projections of one technology, light emitting diodes. Look at the price of LED lights. Fastest learning curve maybe in history. They now cost 50 cents a bulb. They use about 1/5 or less of the electricity. They don't flicker. They last forever, and you can tune them to whatever color you want. It's just one technology, but it's a pretty good one. Refrigerators here, California again led the pack. This is a refrigerator energy use through a series of California standards. This is the price going down, and this is the size going up, right? That's technology doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is delivering a public good as well as a private good. And these Nest thermostats, just put them in your house, and they figure stuff out. A little creepy, but they cut your energy use by 10 or 15%. Here's what else they do. Once you put 1 million of them in, and California ISO knows it's going to be a hot, windless day, which it's going to know 24 hours in advance because we know those things that far ahead, then you can pre-cool those million houses by a couple degrees during the middle of the day, so that you don't have to run your air conditioners in the late afternoon when the sun goes down, but everything's still hot. So you've created a device to manage the imbalance of the grid. In other words, this little gizmo that people are willing to spend their own money on saves the grid. So zero emission buildings. Let me mention something about policy here. The only great two policies that have decarbonized buildings have been a great building code and great appliance standards. There's a lot of other things that sound good, don't do much of a difference. How do building codes get set in America? This is just an astonishing thing to me. So there's this group called the IECC, which is composed of civil engineers and city officials, and they spend 3 or 4 years drafting a new model code. It's just a model. And then the US government looks it over and says, this is pretty good, we're going to adopt it as our model code, just a model still. And then every state can look at it and say, well, I like the new one, or I'm going to stick with the old one. And then they can adopt it, and then they can train builders, and they can enforce it. So that process takes a decade. Meanwhile, technology is rolling along. But here's what I didn't understand until recently. There's a vote as to whether a new model code gets formally adopted. So people can work for 3 or 4 years on the new model code, and then some people get to vote on whether it gets adopted or not. If it doesn't get adopted, it's thrown out. So the last one was 10% stronger, and it failed to get adopted. How did that possibly happen? Who voted? So it turns out there are 100,000 people eligible to vote, and they're city officials from all across the country. Big cities get a lot of people. Small cities get very few people. Guess how many people voted in that? 500. 1/2 of 1% of eligible voters voted. And guess who paid them to vote against it? Home builders and Koch brothers is my guess. That's pretty good evidence. So that's precision intervention waiting to happen. Here's another astonishing figure. Every city in California can vote, and lots of them have lots of votes. None of them vote because we don't use that model code. We have our own code. So why would we care? The reason why we would care is because we want to save the earth, including California, right? So now we're rallying with something called the New Buildings Institute to win the next vote. There's another one coming up this fall. So in some ways that's my point. Which policy, we have to decarbonize buildings. Which policy matters as a great building code? Who decides that building code? There's a series of steps. Aim your force at that decision with the right message and hit it hard. Because I didn't even know all this, right? And I've been in this game for a long time. We have to win these. We have to win these battles. Okay, I'm gonna skip a few slides here. I've talked about it already. Industry is the fourth sector. This is the most complicated because it's heterogeneous, because a lot of the data are proprietary, and because there simply aren't many easy ways to do it. So what we did is we did a very detailed assessment of which type of industry, agriculture, iron and steel, chemicals and plastics, cement, so on, uses the most energy. Again, it's a triage business. Choose the top few, and then look inside each one and see what you can do. Like cement. Globally, cement is more than 5% of climate change. And there are new technologies that can drastically cut carbon emissions in cement. So just to summarize this, there's device efficiency. 45% of all electricity in the world is used in these motors, these huge motors. And most motors are controlled by mechanical valving, right? If you want to get more water, just turn on your tap a little further, right? That's how factories work. Thermodynamically, that's equivalent to putting a brick on your gas pedal and controlling your speed only with a brake. It is. It's much smarter to control the throttle, which is the amount the motor spins. So we've got to start doing stuff like that, right? The best way to get at this, there's a bunch of particulars, and I won't go through them all because I've used up a lot of time already. But a price on carbon makes a big difference in the industry. Industry is exquisitely sensitive to costs and price, and they have a lot of smart engineers doping around their factories trying to figure out ways to save energy. So up the ante a little bit. That's all you got to do. There's one more that I love, which I call substituting design for materials. So if you think of a conventional, let me see if I took a picture of this. No. If you think of a conventional bridge as a concrete slab across a river, this rectangular cross section, something like 60 or 70% of the material in that slab is doing nothing, right? All the forces are at the bottom of the slab and the top of the slab with a little bit of webbing in between. That's why an I-beam is shaped like an I-beam. So instead, if you build a bridge that mimics the forces exactly, precision application of materials like this drawing, you can cut materials used dramatically. Remember, that's steel and cement. Well, how do you do that? Of course, we never do that. It's really expensive and really complicated until, aha, somebody invents 3D printing. So complexity is free with 3D printing. And complexity is substituting design for materials. It's a huge opening field. I've seen 3D printed houses. I've seen all kinds of interesting 3D printed things. It's early days, but it's happening. Green chemistry was another one. So the policies in the manufacturing sector are carbon pricing and then efficiency standards for specific devices. There's also carbon intensity standards for sectors. So California adopted a law last year called Buy Clean. And they say basically you have to buy your steel from the top quintile in carbon emissions of steel manufacturers. So everybody wants to be in the top quintile. That only works in Lake Wobegon. But they can keep fighting, right? Keep trying, keep trying. They didn't do it for cement, but they should have. Because as soon as you do that, somebody's going to say, I'm going to kick their butts, and I'm going to get out there with better technology. Okay, I'm going to wind up now with a few thoughts about intervention strategies. How's my timing? Am I okay for another 5 minutes, 7 minutes?
Yeah.
Yep, okay. So we developed this. This is cumulative carbon emissions by country, China, USA, India, EU, and by sector, with buildings, grid, industry, and transportation. So this is the map of how to win. We have to transform these sectors in these countries. That's what we got to do. For every one of those sectors, I just mentioned there's 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 policies that are killer apps. So the next thing to do is to figure out who's the decision maker and how to influence them, right? And it's not going to be the same in India as it is in the US. And it's not even going to be the same in California as it is in Texas. That's probably a bigger spread. But that's what we have to do. We have no choice. We really have no choice. So I talk about precision interventions. What does that mean? The first thing is, what you guys were already doing, and it's great to see, understand who makes the decision. And it's counterintuitive. Like, who knew that California municipal officials got to basically have a huge voice, if they only wanted to, in the national building code, the national building standard, which we don't even use. So you have to know who makes the decision. And I ask people to write down a name. Name a public utilities commissioner. Name a member of the California Energy Commission. Name the chair of the state budget committee. You know, if you don't know who is making the decision you most care about, how are you going to possibly affect them? And what we don't have time for is a Jeffersonian enlighten everybody, raise the tides that lift all ships strategy. We don't have time for that. We have to be much more precisely aimed. We have to be. The second thing to do is understand in what context do they make their decisions. So let's go to the Public Utilities Commissioners. They will never allow a blackout. Point number 1. So if you come in with a strategy that threatens blackouts, you're gone. They hate raising rates. They should hate raising bills. Right? Bills are rates times volume. If you decrease the volume faster than you increase the rate, you're still saving everybody money. That's the energy efficiency strategy. It's called decoupling. Are they appointed? Are they elected? Are they conservative? Are they liberal? Are they trying to do the right thing and they need public support? Or are they axiomatically resistant to doing the right thing? Is it a meritocratic decision or a whimsical decision? Do they live in a statutory boundary that affects their options? Are they scared of something that happened before, the last blackouts, and so forth? So, are they the governor's patsy, or are they independent thinkers, or both? I mean, that happens too. So if you don't understand the context of their decision, you cannot invent an intervention strategy, right? And then you have to think about affecting them with intensity. I have to turn around and read sometimes. And so I use this word intensity a lot. It's much better to do a great job with three goals than do a halfway medium job with 6 goals. Much better. Winning creates more winning, right? You get momentum. And if you not only win, but then reward them politically, then you've got a friend for life, and you keep it going. It's a positive feedback cycle, in the best sense. So an intensive effort means when the Public Utilities Commission is having a debate, they have fantastic expert testimony, because they can't make a decision unless it's in the record. It's just like the court, right? And there are a lot of brilliant people behind them, and they get a phone call from the governor, and they get a phone call from the mayor, and there's moms and dads with 50 asthmatic kids in the front 2 rows. Like, why are we messing around with this stuff, right? There are local CEOs that want 100% clean energy. All the tech companies want it right now. They don't want to have to do it by themselves. They'd rather live in a green society than have to create a green pathway just for themselves. Just hit them with everything you got. Everything you got. And make sure they have the technical backup, because most don't. California is blessed with unbelievable Public Utilities Commission, Air Board, Energy Commission, and so forth. Most staffing of most public utilities commissions is just dismal. And believe me, the average tenure of a commissioner in America is 3 years. And they're also regulating phones and tow trucks and billboards and all kinds of other stuff. And they got elected because they gave the governor a big amount of money, or they got appointed, right? So how can they possibly resist what the utility tells them? Utility's going to be in there. Utility has experts and lawyers and attorneys and keeps the lights on and has trucks and all that other stuff. And so I'm just going to sit there and tell the utility guy you're wrong? That doesn't happen that often. So then there's interesting math. So I'm going to run through this super quick. We have 50 states, right? There are 250 public utilities commissioners, actually slightly fewer than that. Half the carbon in the U.S. economy is governed by these 250 people. Half the carbon, all the gas and all the electricity, right? Not by U.S. senators, not by the Secretary of Energy. Okay, but scale, speed and scale, only 30 states matter. Kick the 20 little ones out. So we're now down to 150 individuals that decide most of the carbon. We don't have to win a 5-0 vote. A 3-2 vote is just fine with me. And so that takes us to 90 public utilities commissions that control close to half the carbon. They live in a quasi-judicial world. There are rules about how to influence them. They have to listen to you. They have to react to statutory language. So get in there, right? Be smart. Work with the brilliant lawyers from NRDC. Work with the great organizers. Bring in the American Loan Association. Bring in all the stuff that you guys know and learn, and the credibility you have for living in this state. And that's how you win. So I'm gonna wind it up now with just a few thoughts. You have to know the landscape. There's no substitute. It's much better to be expert in one topic, and including the decision-making body, and who makes it, and what are the forces upon them, and so forth. You have to be serious about intensity. It takes time. These are decadal time constants for a lot of these things. Power plants last 50 years. So if we can shut them down in 5 years, we're doing great. But that's not 5 months. Right? It does take time. And if you do all those things, you can flip it. You see, why do I know it? Because we've been involved in more than 30 of them, 30 states where we've won big battles like this. We could do a lot more. We could do a whole lot more. And this is true across the board in utilities, vehicles, buildings, and even in industry. I'm going to skip the rest of my slideshow and leave you with this, because I think this is the recipe. Do the math. Aim at policies, know which policies work, identify the decision maker, learn everything there is to know about the context in which they make their decision, and then hit them for all it's worth. That's how you win. Thank you.
Got Matt? Where's Matt? Okay.
You want to do questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll lead some Q&A.
Great. Thanks. Sure. Some Q&A, some questions for Hal. Yes, sir.
One of the things that I took away from the climate reality training in March of 2017 was that Project Indivisible, Leah Greenberg, and the guy that worked with her, talked about how they simply co-opted the playbook of the Tea Party, copied it exactly, and as we saw in the 2018 elections, it's a very, very effective playbook, and why not? If the other side is doing something smart, just steal it and do the same thing. So is there an ALEC of model legislation and model policies, cradle to grave, from the lowest levels of government to the highest levels, for climate change model legislation? And if not, do we have enough people in this room to make one happen?
You want me to make a pitch from my book again?
No, that's the Bible. But we need the lawyers, guns, and money.
Not in such a coherent way, but actually, if you look sector by sector, there are some outstanding organizations that have done exactly this work. It requires a bit of assembly.
Who are they?
Oh, I'm sorry. There are organizations that do this pretty brilliantly and have done the work. For example, with utility regulations, there's the Regulatory Assistance Project. It's made of former regulators. They work all over the country, helping regulators design these rules. There are some national groups that have incredible depth in as many as 20 states, like NRDC, Environmental Defense Fund, Advanced Energy Economy. And then almost every region has what I call a super regional group. So for example, the Renewable Northwest Project covers the 4 northwestern states. Western Resource Advocates covers 5 Rockies states. Environmental Law and Policy Center of the Midwest covers the Midwest, and so forth. So it's not soup to nuts. We don't have any Koch brothers with $100 billion between the two of them. But we've got some pretty amazing networks.
Thank you so much. You have mentioned a few different things that ring really true to me as a active member for 6 years of Citizens Climate Lobby. One is that pricing matters, and that pricing declines are present at technology changes, and that increasing pricing is very, very effective with things like manufacturing, et cetera. And also, you mentioned the continuous improvement policy, but I have to say that in chapter 13 of your book, in which you take up carbon pricing, I have to say that even though it is one of the biggest solutions, over 28% of the total possible mix, I believe that you shortchange the solution that's now in the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act of 2019, because you don't really talk about that future upward thrust and continuous improvement that's present in that, and you spend too much time on cap and trade, which is natural because we're here in California. But if it's a pure carbon tax with dividending out, making it fairer and more just for all, which you didn't also cover very much, wouldn't it be even better? Can you accept this criticism and do something better with it?
Give it in a loving way.
So I didn't spend much time today on carbon pricing, and apologies for that. Most carbon pricing schemes around the world have failed. The principal exception is California. California's got a really good system. They mostly failed because they set caps higher than business as usual emissions, which is a what? It's like a upside down pole or something like that. It turns out it is a tiny tax, right? $2 a ton for years and years in the UK and in REGI. In the EU and in REGI. So one of the things we advocate for is, if it's a cap, putting a floor on the price and a ceiling on the price, which the state of California does. When you hit the floor, you quit selling permits. When you hit the ceiling, you sell extra permits. So you lose a little bit of certainty, environmental certainty, but you gain, you avoid this problem of overallocation. The difference between a cap and a tax is you should choose whichever one you can get, right? If one is much more politically palatable than the other, but in most reasonable ranges, they do exactly the same thing. And if anybody tells you a tax is simpler, then ask them to deadweight lift the US tax code, because it's 10,000 pages long. And remember, Waxman-Markey, which was the cap, was 1,800 pages long. It's easy to make a tax complicated by exempting trade-exposed industries, and there you go, right? You can make a cap complicated or a tax complicated. You can make either of them simple. If you get either one, if you can get them past the U.S. Senate, hooray! Or if you get it past the state legislature, hooray! It for sure should have continuous improvement in it, because that's the camel's nose under the tent, and we want the whole damn camel in there.
48-page bill.
That's good, right? And how many votes?
35 so far in the House.
So it's great. So it's a good start. But in the meantime, let's go in some P's and V's.
More questions? Yes.
Thank you. This is so wonderful. I'm wondering if you can say something about regulatory capture. It's definitely affected our PUC, and I definitely hit up against that brick wall, even with some political capital. And so, does that surround sound strategy still work in that instance?
So, I think everyone knows regulatory capture is when the regulators become, in some ways, dependent upon the regulated industry. The worst example of that is in the Deep South, where the Southern Company, owns these folks lock, stock, and barrel. But there's a lot of examples of that around the country. I think that oftentimes the best way to do that is with deeply technical work, basically showing how consumers are getting ripped off, or how we're spending too much on power, or how we're buying too dirty power, if possible. It's hard in the long run to be credentialed economic and technical studies. And it's also, the utilities are better at these arguments than we will ever be, right? They're really good at it. They hire $1,000 an hour lawyers, and they've been to every single hearing since the beginning of time, and they know they have the upper hand. So you got to be more clever with them. Regulatory capture is the thing. I actually don't think it's such a problem in California. I mean, compared to other states, we live in heaven.
Thank you for an excellent book and talk today. How important do you think it is to have global policies that are either exactly the same or at least synchronized in some way?
So, this is the whole thing about the United Nations meetings. First of all, the people that negotiate United Nations meetings are typically foreign ministers. And when a foreign minister goes home, do they control the energy system? No, not at all. They have zero control over that. Maybe they have influence, but they certainly don't have control. At the end of the day, remember, if it doesn't show up in your car, your house, your factory, or your grid, you didn't do anything, right? So all the cosmic treaties in the world don't matter. They matter when they bring something home. The vernacular used, or the vocabulary used in the global climate treaties are independent, nationally determined contributions, right? Each of those words is a fudge word. Independent means you don't tell me what I do, I tell me what to do. Nationally determined means the same thing. Contribution is very different than commitment. So that's what the global system has settled on, as a way of one nation not coercing the other nation. Now, could you do it in a voluntary system with enlightened nations? The European Union is the best example of that. And it's a bit of a lowest common denominator problem because they need 28 votes, including Poland, which loves coal, right? So if you can imagine a system that's a race to the top instead of a race to the bottom, then you can get there. Now, the best example I can think of that is when Quebec and Ontario joined the California cap and trade system. Of course, Ontario pulled right back out when they had a new election. Quebec is still in. But I actually see, with all these commitments we have, all those governors, I think we're going to see a lot of states agreeing to that thing, but they will never give away an iota of their sovereignty to another country. It just doesn't work. I know it's a, anti-idealistic answer, but once again, we don't have time. We've got to do the practical stuff.
Thank you. With that answer, I start to worry about cap and trade and carbon offsets, in particular carbon offsets which really don't do anything and kind of just shift the burden somewhere else. So I want to know what you think about that. For instance, I know that there have been a lot of problems with carbon offsets just simply not working because they count expected returns that never materialize. But they can also just bounce pollution.
Yeah. And get your work out. So, two more things about either caps or taxes. Offsets can be real, but they have to be done very carefully. They have to be purely additive. And some it's fairly easy. Let's say Oregon has a 50% renewable portfolio standard, and you put in windmills to take them to 60%. That's clearly additive, and they're going to spin, right? And you allocate the offset not according to the capital spent, but according to the energy generated. They can also be used for very tricky businesses. So, for example, capturing methane from manure in California feedlots is a little too expensive for farmers to do, but pretty cheap on a per avoided ton of carbon equivalent basis. So there are opportunities like that. It's harder, the farther away you get from home, the less monitoring there is, the tougher it gets. So afforestation schemes in Honduras, I don't know, right? I wouldn't throw them away though, because there's a lot of good things we need to do. And having some cash can be a useful way to stimulate new businesses that otherwise wouldn't start. That's the California cap was designed to set a cap on carbon and make sure we stay under it. it happens to spin off about $3 billion a year of unallocated money, which can be used for further decarbonization. It doesn't even count under the cap. And helps you get into poor communities, communities with filthy air, and hard-to-reach industries and sectors. So, you know, I don't think cash is the #1 priority, but if you can have money aimed at good purposes, you can do good things with it. So I wouldn't give up on them. Be vigilant.
So we're going to have to wrap up. I'm going to exercise privilege.
Can we do Mark Levine?
Oh, sure.
I'd send him the softball. So, going after the big emitters makes sense, but I worry when we talk about countries that omitting the smaller developing countries, the large number of smaller developing countries, the ones that really can't do this, if you analyze future emissions and assume that China and India can be managed, that is, be optimistic, you end up with most of our emissions coming from the developing world, the countries that really can't contain their emissions. So I just thought I'd point that out and give you a chance to comment.
So my first trip to China, I've now made 70 trips to China, but my first trip was with Mark Levine, meeting with many Chinese policymakers. You know, there's a lot of pathways, and what I presented here is simplistic. I'm trying to be slightly brutalist, actually, more than simplistic, in saying big countries, speed and scale, key policies, don't waste time, do everything with intensity, because we have to do that. But you're absolutely right. There are, you know, if you look at Africa, which is the fastest growing population in the world, and is really highly urbanized population. All the new growth in Africa is urban. And it's disorganized urbanization and has problems. At $500 per capita per year, carbon emissions are negligible. At $1,000, they're negligible. At $3,000, everyone's got a refrigerator, a car, an air conditioner, something like that, right? So there's this income carbon curve that takes a big pop somewhere around $3,000, $5,000, $7,000. If we don't pay attention before that pop happens, we've squandered an opportunity. I'm most heartened by the Kigali amendments, which are getting rid of HFCs, but also have a big energy efficiency strategy for the air conditioners behind them, because this is going to happen. So if we get ahead of the problem in those fast-growing regions, we absolutely should. Thank you.
One final question. We have a lot of experts in this room, a lot of smart people, but this whole experiment that we're doing with the Climate Reality Projects is to create agency for people that aren't experts. How do we do that? Your book is getting at that. It's still very complicated. 30 years of all of this work, and it blows people away. It blows me away, and I've been in the world a little bit myself over these years. And so, in your last comments, can you just speak to the volunteers that aren't experts, and just say, hang in there, work on these experiments, and let's exercise that muscle?
So in the presentations that preceded mine today, there was one that said, in Contra Costa County, in District 5, I need you to meet with this council member, right? That is political wisdom, right there. I used to say in Colorado, a rancher's vote is worth, 50 environmentalist votes, right? Because they shake your hand with a big paw, and they got the hat, and they got the cows, and they've been there for 50 years or 100 years. And there's ethical credibility by being from where you are and talking from your own experience. And they say every good argument has ethos, logos, and pathos, right? We nailed the logos by going to the Al Gore seminar, by reading my book, and so on. But we have to deliver ethos and pathos, because that's what's going to turn people around. That's why I said, bring in the asthmatic kids. They're having trouble breathing. Your decisions affect their ability to breathe. Connect those dots. That's not dirty tricks. That's the cleanest, purest way you can to say you have a responsibility to the public as you're a public official, right? And if you live in a town or a state or a country, you have agency right there. And so bring in that ethical credibility and stand up for it and bring in neighbors and talk to the decision maker. Don't squander it on ideas that don't scale or people who don't make decisions. Life's too short.
Great. Hal Harvey.